Pull for the shore, sailor, pull for the shore. Heed not the mighty waves, but bend to the oar. Safe in the lifeboat, sailor, trust himself no more. Leave the poor old stranded wreck and pull for the shore.
Hey folks, this is my dad John.
Hi.
Dad is in his 80s now. He has a neurological problem that makes it hard for him to talk, so hopefully today he can share the story with us. And he's the man that built the houseboat that I'm living on currently, or have been. Dad's built a number of boats. He's been a marine engineer through his life. He's been a ranger, he's been a skipper. He's built lots of things for our community, for just doing community work. And he's got a really interesting story about the Kohi, which was a flat bottom boat that was used for transporting cargo. And Dad was the marine engineer on that. This story needs to be told because it's actually one that will get lost otherwise. So I'm going to let Dad tell us that story in his words. What exactly is a scow, Dad?
Well, scows were originally come from North America, and they were flat bottom boats without a bow, just had like a punt front on them, and they sailed. And they realised that that'd be the ideal thing for working around the shallow waters of New Zealand into the estuary areas and the rivers. So they started building them out here, and after a while they started changing them slightly to put a bow on them.
Right.
So they were dead flat, absolutely flat on the bottom, and they carried all their cargo on deck. They were the deck scows. Later on they had holds put in them. They were different again. They had a hold scow, but the one that I was in, the Kohi, was the last of the deck scows to be trading. We were in little Wanganui on the west coast, loaded up with a full load of timber, of furniture grade rimu and kahikatea and matai, and we were about to go to Wanganui in the North Island.
Were you under sail, or were you with did they have an onboard engine in that
They
boat?
had onboard engines. The Kohi had sunk at Picton the year before alongside the wharf and had been taken to Wellington and re-engined. So she had two Ford truck engines in her, which weren't the most ideal, but they did get her around, and she had a full speed of 6 knots, which isn't very fast.
Right, okay.
Towards the end of 1963, and I can't remember the exact time.
Yep.
But anyway, we headed off up the coast and ran into some pretty heavy weather, and we started to lose the sheathing off the side. Now, the sheathing was just a 1-inch layer of totara that was put around the side of those wooden boats in those days because totara is good to keep out the teredo worm. Teredo worm does not like totara, so they put totara in the outside. And that went as a cladding. Well, that started to come off in the sea, and we started to leak badly as we headed up the coast, and we got up down to Farewell Spit, and the skipper realised we were in trouble, so we headed back to Golden Bay and went into Waitapu, which is a port that we went in and out of quite often.
What crew was on board?
Crew was 3 ABs, the skipper, myself, engineer, and the deck boy.
Can you explain what an AB is, Dad?
An AB is an able-bodied seaman.
Yep.
So we went into Waitapu. It was right on the top of the tide, so we went up onto the mudflats, and when the tide went out, she was left sitting on the mudflats. Unfortunately, we couldn't do anything with the bottom because she was dead flat bottom, so we could do nothing there. So we had to do something on the side. So we recorked the sides because we'd lost a lot of the corking, which is the stuff that stops the water getting in through the seams. And then we clad that with just 3x1 radiata pine treated. More we could get, really.
Right.
Couldn't get torture, so that was to get the job done. And 3 days later, we managed to get that done and headed off to sea again, heading for Wanganui. She was still leaking, but it wasn't as bad as it had been. So we headed off, and it was calm weather, getting along at a good 6 knots. And as we get up round towards D'Urville Island, we noticed that we're starting to turn away from the southeast, which is a strong wind that blows through Cook Strait and can put up some very big seas. As we got further on, the wind increased until we were out about probably 10 to 12 miles west of Stevens Island off the end of D'Urville Island. And by this time we were really in a very big sea, and it was getting worse. So the skipper decided that we'd head for Port Hardy, which is at the northern end of D'Urville Island, and go in there for shelter. Now, the weather was such that we found that 12 hours later, and I'm not going to fill you in on all the details.
12 hours later from that point, you've been getting...
12 hours later from that first point of turning into it, we still hadn't got anywhere near Port Hardy. In fact, I don't think we got anywhere, just up and down on the same hole, and we're taking a real hammering. She was leaking very badly, and we had every pump in the boat going flat out. I had everything that could pumping water over the side. The deck boy on the deck pump outside of the engine room door.
How does that operate? It's by hand?
By hand. It's a hand operated pump, and he was nearly washed over the side at one point with the sea coming in, because there was plenty of water about, and water was getting right through the vessel, and she was into the engine room, and it was being thrown around the engine room by the fuel pump couplings when we went on a bit of a slosh. And so in the end, I called the skipper on the communications tube, which you don't see them these days, but they're a piece of copper tube that went from the engine room up to the wheelhouse, had a whistle in both ends, so when you wanted to talk, you pulled out your whistle, blew into it, and it blew the whistle at the other end, and the person at the other end would pick it up, and from then on you would carry on a conversation, putting your ear or your mouth to the voice tube.
Right.
And I said to him that we had got to the point where things were only going to get worse, much worse, and that we would not survive unless we did something. And I suggested that we should turn around. He said he didn't think that was a good idea. We had that much water on board, that as we went about, she might get all the water on one side and roll over. But I said, well, we don't have much of a choice. How about go about and see if we can get onto the end of Farewell Spit, which was a long way away, but still one of those that we could run with the weather and at the end of. So anyway, in the end, he decided that we had to do that. So went about, and it took a long time to go about. She just seemed to lay beam on for ages. But eventually we got about, and sure, a few times there when we were pretty worried. And
were you fearful of your life at all, any time?
I was only, 24 at the time, and didn't think about losing my life.
Was it in the middle of the night?
It was the middle of the night, right through the night.
What have you done to stop the leaking inside? I heard stories that you're taking your clothes off.
Oh, yeah, I took clothes off and nailed pieces of wood over them onto seams and that to try and stop the water coming in.
Right. You were down to your undies.
Yeah, I was down to my underpants, and I had a life jacket on. Mm-hmm. And yes, I should have been scared, but there's too much to do and to think about that. You just got to think about trying to keep the boat afloat. And
so what were the ABs doing?
I don't know. I don't know what they were doing. The ABs we had on board at that time weren't the greatest, and I don't think they were doing anything very much. I think the skipper was at the wheel. Yeah. The deck boy was on the deck pump, and I was in the engine room manning the engine room pumps.
How long was he going on the pump for? Because that'd be physically demanding.
It was, and I'm not sure just exactly how long he was there for, but a little bit later on, when we got about and I got the water under control as we ran before the sea and no longer belting into it head first,
yep.
I managed to get the water under control. And
what was the state of the deck boy doing that job?
He was absolutely buggered. His hands were bleeding because he was on the end of a rusty old bit of steel pipe.
Jeez.
That was the handle.
And he's going all the time.
And he'd been going all the time. And he was only a youngster, probably 16 or 17 years old. I can't even remember his name.
Right.
But I know it was I took my hat off to him that night because what he was doing was really beyond the call of duty. Yeah. But he did it. And anyway, we got a wee way away, about an hour and a half after I underway, got the water under control, and we headed towards to Waitapu, back in Golden Bay where we come from, because we had now had the boat virtually dry again, or reasonably dry, and thought we could get back there. Now, we got back to Waitapu, but she never went to sea again. That was the end of her.
It was her last voyage.
Yeah, last voyage. At one point there was a talk about shutting down and anchoring the boat and going further on after we'd had a rest of that, but I said I wouldn't shut the motors down because the starter motors had been right underwater. Oh. And they would be no longer working. So I said, these motors have just got to keep running.
Mm. And you never get it started again?
Because they won't start again.
Wow.
So that was it. Today, she forms part of the wharf at Westhaven Inlet, at Mangarako Wharf. And not much of her left now. She's looking pretty sad. She spent more time in Westhaven Inlet.
Right.
Being part of the wharf there than she did in all the years she was at sea. So that's since 1963 to now.
What construction is she, Kohi?
It's all Kohi hull, yeah. It's what we call a post and rail construction. Unlike most vessels which are planked fore and aft on the bottom, these scows were planked athwartships. That's side to side. And then they had posts all through them which supported the deck, and then a flat deck on top, and all the cargo was carried on deck.
I really appreciate that, Dad. Thanks for sharing the story. It's a great story, and I'm glad you survived it.
Yes, am I.
Well, I wouldn't be here doing this if you hadn't, would I?
No.
Well, as I say, having children's hereditary. If you parents didn't have any chances, you won't have any either.
No, that's absolutely right, yeah.
Thanks, Dad. Great story. Appreciate it.
Pull for the shore, sailor, pull for the shore. Heed not the mighty waves, but band to the oar. Safe in the lifeboat, sailor, trust himself no more. Leave the poor old stranded wreck and pull for the shore.